Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is brought to you by the Star Quest Production Network and is made possible by our many generous patrons. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. You're listening to episode 320 of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, where we look at mysteries from the twin perspectives of faith and reason. In this episode, we're talking about Whitley Strieber's book, Communion. I'm Dom Bettinelli, and joining me today is Jimmy Akin. Hey, Jimmy.
Howdy, Dom.
In 1987, author Whitley Strieber was a successful novelist. Then he published a book titled Communion, A True Story. This was not a novel. Strieber indicated, as the book's subtitle indicated, that it was a true story. The book described his encounters with and abductions by creatures he refers to as the visitors. They appeared to be aliens, and his account of the visitors became incredibly popular. Communion became a New York Times #1 bestseller, and it changed the course of Strieber's career. Who are the visitors that he describes? What did they do to him? And what really happened? That's what we'll be talking about on this episode of Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World. Jimmy, anything we should say to begin today's episode?
Well, this episode is in response to a listener request from Joe Gibbons. He's the owner of the Ash and Ember Pipe and Tobacco Shop in Siloam Springs, Arkansas. And he's the guy that formulated and makes the St. Michael's Holiday Blend of pipe tobacco for me, which I've talked about on the show before. If you're interested, you can call them and order some through the mail. Joe is very interested in mysterious subjects, and once when I was at the shop, he asked me if I would be doing an episode on Whitley Strieber, whose books he's read. He said that he has his own opinions about Strieber, but was interested in what mine would be, and so I'm happy to be able to do this episode. I should point out one limitation on it, though. Since Communion, Strieber has written a bunch of nonfiction books related to aliens and such, and I haven't had time to read and evaluate them all. So today, we will be focusing just on his initial encounters with the strange, as reported in Communion. In the future, we may look at other books that Strieber has done and comment on them too.
When did you first become aware of Whitley Strieber and his works?
It was either in the late 70s or early 80s after his first horror novel, The Wolfen, which is about wolf-like predators, was published. I used to work in a used bookstore, and I remember seeing his books there. Later, in the 1980s, after Communion came out, I remember sitting with my wife Renee and watching Strieber on one of those afternoon TV talk shows that they used to have. I'm not sure if they still have those since I don't have cable, but I remember Renee being quite skeptical of Strieber. I don't as much remember having a super strong opinion myself, though. Since then, I've been aware of Strieber through his appearances on the old Art Bell show. He even co-wrote a book with Art Bell, and he has a podcast called Dreamland and a website called unknowncountry.com.
Why is the book called Communion?
Because that's what he thinks or hopes that we may be able to achieve with the visitors, a kind of mutual understanding or interpersonal communion with them. However, he's not sure that this will happen. In the introduction to the 2022 edition of the book, he says that he's not certain that all is well with them, meaning he's not sure that they're not a threat to mankind, but he hopes that we can achieve a form of rapprochement or communion with them.
Then let's talk about the book itself. What should we know about it?
The core of the book is a series of encounters that Strieber reports having with the visitors. There are 4 major encounters, and we'll be focusing on those. We won't be looking at them in chronological order, though. Instead, we'll be looking at them in the order that Strieber discovered them, because at first he didn't remember or understand the significance of some of the earlier ones.
Then let's look at the first experience that really got his attention. When did it happen, and what was Strieber doing at the time?
It occurred in December of 1985, and Strieber had most recently published a novel called War Day with a co-author. Unlike some of his novels, this one was not a horror novel. Instead, it was about the dangers of limited nuclear war, and it involved a protagonist traveling across the country 5 years after the nukes fell. And in Communion, Strieber says this novel was very successful and was getting him new respect, since it wasn't just another horror novel. At the time, Strieber, his wife Anne, and his young son Andrew were living in New York City, but they also had a cabin in upstate New York in Ulster County that they would spend a lot of time at, since Whitley would do much of his writing there. At this time, Whitley had never seen a UFO. He was extremely skeptical of the idea that aliens might be visiting Earth, and he never really looked into the subject. The event itself occurred on December 26th, the day after Christmas, and it's the longest and most detailed of his experiences. So we'll be covering it in detail so that we can have a good basis for evaluating it in the Faith and Reason sections. The other experiences won't be anything like this long. But after dinner, the family was settling down for the evening, and Whitley writes,
At about 8:30, I turned on the burglar alarm, which covers every accessible window and all the doors. For no reason then apparent, I had developed an unusual habit the previous fall. As secretly as ever, I made a tour of the house, peering in closets and even looking under the guest room bed for hidden intruders. I did this immediately after setting the alarm. By 10 o'clock, we were in bed, and by 11, both of us were asleep.
However, Whitley woke up unexpectedly, and this is what he initially remembered of the experience. In what follows, Whitley uses the term hypnopompic, which I ought to explain. The hypnopompic state is when you're waking up from sleep. It's the opposite of the hypnagogic state, which is when you're falling asleep. In Greek, hypnos means sleep, agogos means leader, and pompe means sending away. So the hypnagogic state is when you're being led towards sleep. The hypnopompic state is when you're sending away sleep. In both conditions, your mind is fuzzy as you're between full sleep and full wakefulness. Whitley writes,
In the middle of the night on December 26th, I do not know the exact time, I abruptly found myself awake. And I know why. I heard a peculiar whooshing, swirling noise coming from the living room downstairs. There was no random creak, no settling of the house, but a sound as if a large number of people were moving rapidly around the room. I listened carefully. The noise just didn't make sense. I sat up in bed, shocked and very curious. There was an edge of fear. The night was dead still, windless. My eyes went straight to the burglar alarm panel beside the bed. The system was armed and working perfectly. Not a covered window or door was open, and nobody had entered, at least according to the row of glowing lights. What I did next may seem peculiar. I settled back in bed. For some reason, the extreme strangeness of what I was hearing did not rouse me to action. Over the course of this narrative, this sort of inappropriate response will be repeated many times. If something is strange enough, the reaction is very different from what you would think. The mind seems to tune it out as if by some sort of instinct. No sooner than I had settled back than I noticed that one of the double doors leading into the bedroom was moving closed. As they close outward, this means that the opening was getting smaller, concealing whatever was behind the door. I sat up again. My mind was sharp. I was not asleep, nor in a hypnopompic state between sleep and waking. I wish to be clear that I felt, at that moment, wide awake and in full possession of my faculties. I could have easily gotten up and read a book, or listened to the radio, or gone for a midnight walk in the snow. I did not imagine what could be going on, and I got very uneasy. My heart started beating harder. I wasn't settled back anymore. I was sitting up, a question just forming in my mind. What could be moving the door? Then I saw edging around it a compact figure. It was so distinct and yet so completely and possibly astonishing that at first I could not understand it at all. I simply sat there staring, too stunned to move. The room was dim but not dark. The burglar alarm panel alone emitted enough light for me to see. In addition, there was snow on the ground, and that added some ambient light. Had it been a person peeking into the room, I could have made out his or her features clearly. The figure was too small to be a person, unless a child. I measured the approximate distance that the top of the head was from the ground, based on my memory of the figure's position in the doorway. and I believe that it was roughly 3.5 feet tall, altogether smaller and lighter than my son. I could see perhaps a third of the figure, the part that was bending around the door so that it could see me. It had a smooth, rounded hat on, with an old, sharp rim that jutted out easily 4 inches on the side I could see. Below this was a vague area. I could not see the face, or perhaps I would not see it. A few minutes later, when it was close to the bed, I saw 2 dark holes for eyes, and a black downturning line of a mouth that later became an O. From shoulder to midriff was a visible third of a square plate etched with concentric circles. This plate stretched from just below the chin to the waist area. At the time, I thought it looked like some sort of breastplate, or even an armored vest. Beneath it was a rectangular appliance of the same type, which covered the lower waist just above the knees. The angle that the individual was leaning was such that the lower legs were hidden behind the door. I was quite shocked, but what I was seeing was so strange, I had to assume that it was a dream. Maybe this is why I continued to sit on the bed, taking no action. Or perhaps my mind was already under some sort of control. In any case, I sat there frightened, but unable or unwilling to deal with what I was observing. My mind explained my vision to me. Despite my full wakefulness, it must be a hypnopompic hallucination. Such phenomena sometimes occur as one drifts between waking and sleep. I assumed that some minor disturbances had awakened me, and I was experiencing such an illusion, and never mind the fact that I felt fully awake. Because of the isolation, the house not only had a burglar alarm, but contained a shotgun, which was not far from the bed at the time. Was that why the thing behind the door was wearing a shield, if that was indeed what it was? I have subsequently wondered if an earlier reconnaissance of the house might not have taken place and revealed the presence of the weapon? Next thing I knew, the figure came rushing into the room. I recall only blackness after that, for an unknown period of time. I don't remember falling asleep or lying awake. What I do remember was far, far more disturbing. My next conscious recollection is of being in motion. I was naked, with my arms and legs extended, as if I had been frozen in mid-leap. I was moving out of the room. There was no physical sensation at all, not of being touched, not of being warm or cold. I could feel myself as a shape and a mass, but not in terms of sensation. It was as if I had become profoundly paralyzed. Although I wanted desperately to move, I could not. Because of my state of apparent paralysis, I'm afraid that I cannot report that I was floating along on some magical pallet or a flying carpet. It could easily be that I was being carried. In any case, I was at that point in a state of panic. Gone was my fleeting thought of dream or hallucination. Something was hideously wrong. So wrong that my mind went blank. I couldn't think. Even if I had been able to make a sound, which I doubt, I couldn't try. I must have blacked out again, because I have no further memories of being moved. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a small, sort of depression in the woods. It was quite dark, and frozen creeper was pressing tightly around me. I remember being startled that there was no snow on the gray earth. I sat with my legs partly bent and my hands in my lap. Although I cannot recall this in any detail, I may have been leaning against something. I was still absent sensation. Across the depression to my left, there was a small individual whom I could only see out of the corner of my eye. This person was wearing a gray-tan bodysuit and sitting on the ground, with knees drawn up and hands clasped around them. There were 2 dark eye holes and a round mouth hole. I had the impression of a face mask. I felt that I was under the exact and detailed control of whomever had me. I could not move my head or my hands or any part of my body, save for my eyes. Despite this, I was not tied. Immediately on my right was another figure. This one completely invisible, except for an occasional flash of movement. This person was working busily on something that seemed to have to do with the right side of my head. It wore dark blue coveralls and was extremely fast. The depression appeared to be no more than 4 feet in diameter. But my eyes were not functioning normally. Maybe for no other reason than that I wasn't wearing my glasses. I was mildly nearsighted. While the presence of the others remains vague in my mind, the individual to my left made a clear impression. I do not know why, but I had the distinct feeling that this was a woman, and so I shall refer to her in the feminine. She was as small as the others and appeared almost bored or indifferent. I also felt that she was explaining something to me, but I cannot remember what it was. I then saw branches moving past my face, then a sweep of treetops. I looked down, and below me, the whole tall forest was corkscrewing slowly to the right. There was no chance to question how in the world I had gotten above the trees. I only saw and recorded. Then a gray floor obscured my vision, slipping below my face like an iris closing. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in a messy, round room. My impression is that at this point, I was actually being cradled by these people, as if they were aware of what was about to transpire.
Whitley reports that at this point he was extremely scared, partly due to the paralysis he was experiencing, not to mention this completely unexpected set of happenings, but he continued observing.
The small circular chamber had a domed, grayish-tan ceiling, with ribs appearing at intervals of about a foot. I had an impression that it was messy, a living space. Across the room to my right, some clothing was thrown on the floor. As a matter of fact, the thought even crossed my mind that the place was actually dirty. It was close and confining for me. The whole scale of it was small, tight, and enclosed. I seem to remember that the room was stuffy, and the air quite dry, so it could be that the numbness of panic was wearing off. The people were now moving around me at great speed. The quickness was disturbing, and in a curious way, ugly. I had the thought that I was being taken away. Despite my extreme terror, I was aware of my surroundings. I know that I was seated on a bench, leaning against a wall. The predominant colors were tan and gray. The bench was the same color as the walls, and was rimmed by a lip of dark brown. From the clarity of my memory of these rather muted colors, I surmised that the room was lit, although I did not see the source of the light. There was something quite beautiful, I think, having to do with the lens in the ceiling, but I can remember little about it. Perhaps there was a lens at the point of the ceiling, through which some colorful scene could be observed. There is no way to be certain of how long I remained in this room. It seemed to be a stay of no more than a few minutes, or even seconds. It may have been longer, though, because I had time to look around me and note numerous details. While I had before been totally paralyzed, I was now able to move at least my eyes, and possibly my head. One being was on my right, another on my left. Within my field of vision, a great deal of rushing about commenced again. The next thing I knew, I was being shown a tiny gray box with a sliding lid. There was a curved lip at one end of this box, to make it easy to push it open. It was being held by a thin, graceful person, whose appearance was not distinct. Was this the female again? I'm not sure. It almost seems, as I remember, that something had been done to my eyes to affect my ability to concentrate my vision. Glances around the room were quite detailed in recollection, but any attempt to steady my vision and view a particular being resulted in blurring. It would be interesting to know if this was an induced effect, or something caused by my own fear of what I was seeing. My memory of the one who came before me next is of a tiny, squat person, crouching as if huddled over something. He had been given the box and now slid it open, revealing an extremely shiny, hair-thin needle mounted on a black surface. The needle glittered when I saw it out of the corner of my eye, but was practically invisible straight on. I became aware I think I was told, that they proposed to insert this into my brain. If I had been afraid before, I now became quite simply crazed with terror. I argued with them. "This place is filthy," I remember saying. "Then you'll ruin a beautiful mind." I could imagine my family awakening in the morning and finding me as a vegetable. A great sadness overtook me. I do not recall screaming, but suddenly I was doing so, because I remember the next exchange quite clearly. One of them, I think it was the one I had identified earlier as the woman, said, "What can we do to help you stop screaming?" This voice was remarkable. It was definitely aural, that is to say, I heard it rather than sensed it. It had a subtly electronic tone to it, the accents flat and startlingly Midwestern. My reply was unexpected. I heard myself say, "You could let me smell you." I was embarrassed. That is not a normal request, and it bothered me. But it made a great deal of sense, as I have afterward realized. The one to my right replied, "Oh, okay, I can do that," in a similar voice, speaking very rapidly, and held his hand against my face, cradling my head with his other hand. The odor was distinct, and it gave me exactly what I needed, an anchor in reality. It remained the most convincing aspect of the whole memory, because that odor was completely indistinguishable from a real one. It did not seem in any way a dream experience or a hallucination. I remembered it as an actual smell. There was a slight scent of cardboard to it, as if the sleeve of the coverall that was partly pressed against my face were made of some substance like paper. The hand itself had a faint but distinctly organic sourness in the odor. It was not a human smell, but it was unmistakably the smell of something alive. There was a subtle overtone that seemed to be a little like cinnamon. The next thing I knew, there was a bang and a flash, and I realized that they had performed the proposed operation on my head. I felt like weeping, and I recall sinking down into the cradle of tiny arms. At this point, I had some feeling, and enough muscle tone had returned to enable me to slide my feet along the floor, in an effort to avoid falling all the way. Then I was lifted up and seemed suddenly to be in another room. Or perhaps I simply saw my present surroundings differently. It appeared to be a small operating theater. I was in the center of it on a table, and 3 tiers of benches were populated with a few huddled figures, some with round, as opposed to slanted, eyes.
And here, Whitley describes several different types of figures that he saw.
I was aware that I had seen 4 different types of figures. The first was the small robot-like being that had led the way into my bedroom. He was followed by a large group of short, stocky ones in the dark blue coveralls. These had wide faces, appearing either dark gray or dark blue in that light, with glittering, deep-set eyes, pug noses, and broad, somewhat human mouths. Inside the room, I encountered 2 types of creatures that did not look at all human. The most provocative of these was about 5 feet tall, very slender and delicate, with extremely prominent and mesmerizing black slanted eyes. That being had an almost vestigial mouth and nose. The huddled figures in the theater were somewhat smaller, with similarly shaped heads but round, black eyes like large buttons. Throughout the whole experience, the stocky ones were always present. They were apparently responsible for moving and controlling me, and I had the distinct impression that they were a sort of good army. Why good, I do not know.
So some of these sound very much like gray aliens, which were not yet as popular as they are now, though Betty and Barney Hill, who we talked about in episode 61 and again in episode 62, had reported aliens similar to grays, though not identical. And Steven Spielberg's 1997 movie, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, had used grays that were totally naked. The image of the grays thus was out there in popular culture, though it wasn't as tightly linked to the idea of aliens as it is now. In Whitley's case, he reported various aliens wearing clothing, like the ones he described as robot-like that or like the one he described as robot-like that first entered his room and seemed to be wearing a face mask and what might have been armor, perhaps to protect the point man they were sending in from Whitley's shotgun. The others were wearing blue coveralls, and this corresponds to what Betty and Barney Hill reported about the beings they encountered. They also were wearing clothing and coveralls, if I remember correctly, though their descriptions of the aliens varied over time. Whitley also reported that the aliens all seemed to move in a quick but stiff and very coordinated and controlled manner, which led him to speculate some interesting things that we'll hear about later on. But for now, back to the story.
Events once again started moving very quickly. One of them took my right hand and made an incision on my forefinger. There was no pain at all. Abruptly, my memories end. There isn't even blackness, just mourning. I had no further recollection of the incident. I awoke the morning of the 27th, very much as usual, but grappling with a very distinct sense of unease, and a very improbable but intense memory of seeing a barn owl staring at me through the window sometime during the night.
Whitley looked for barn owl tracks in the snow outside the window pane, but didn't see any. He later speculated that this memory of the barn owl looking at him may have been a screen memory.
Okay, that will be an unfamiliar term for some listeners. What's a screen memory?
It's a term that was coined by Sigmund Freud in 1899. He published a paper called Screen Memories. Basically, a screen memory is a memory that seems innocent but screens us from something traumatic. For example, you might remember a day in your childhood where you did something like playing on a beach and found a seashell. But Freud would say this is only a screen and something traumatic really happened to you, something that you can't bear to face. And so your mind has created this innocent memory of finding a shell to screen you, to protect you from the memory of what actually happened.
What do you make of this idea?
I'm very skeptical of it, particularly in the form that Freud proposed. In the first place, a large number of Freud's theories have not fared well over time. They have not been supported by later research, and Freudian psychology has been largely abandoned. Even the minority of mental health professionals who still consider themselves Freudian are using a highly modified form of Freud's thought. Also, Freud has what strikes me as a paranoid way of looking at human experience, where things have hidden symbolic meanings so that they represent things that are dark, shameful, or traumatic. That's why the quotation often attributed to Freud that sometimes a cigar is just a cigar as opposed to a symbol for something else is considered highly ironic, even though he probably never said it. Well, I think a cigar is almost always a cigar, and we shouldn't be looking for dark, disturbing, or traumatic hidden meanings for ordinary, innocent things. When you do that and start claiming that there are hidden, buried memories of trauma that can be recovered through psychological techniques, then you get things like the 1990s satanic ritual abuse moral panic that ruined lives and family relationships and put innocent people in jail. All based on phony recovered memories that mental health workers convinced people to come up with, even though they had no memories of experiencing satanic ritual abuse as children, and the whole thing turned out to be a colossal load of nonsense.
You said that you're skeptical of the idea of screen memories in the form that Freud proposed. Is there another form in which it's been proposed?
Yeah, in the UFO community, many people are convinced that aliens are able to mess with our memories, so they might be able to abduct you and then blank your memory of the abduction experience. Or maybe they can't make you totally forget it, so they give you a screen memory to keep you from remembering what really happened.
Why would you be less skeptical of this than the Freudian version of screen memories?
Well, we really do have the ability to affect people's memories through artificial means. We have that today. For example, we have drugs like Versed, also known as midazolam, that impairs the formation of new memories while you're under its influence. So if you're about to undergo a potentially traumatic medical procedure, but the doctors want you awake for it, they may give you a drug like Versed so that you can be awake and cooperative, but you won't remember the procedure afterwards, and so you won't be traumatized by the memory. When I had my cataracts out a number of years ago, they gave me such a drug, but they didn't give me enough because I remember all of both of my cataract surgeries. Fortunately, I'm not traumatized by those memories because I found the surgeries very interesting, and they had me on enough drugs that I was quite relaxed and enjoying myself and cracking jokes through the surgeries, but I remember them. In any case, we do have the ability to artificially affect people's memories, and aliens with the ability to fling themselves between the stars would presumably have even better techniques for memory manipulation than we do. So maybe they could do things like implant screen memories. I'm just a little less skeptical of the UFO version of screen memories than the Freudian version.
But you're still skeptical.
Yes, because if aliens are blocking people's memories, I don't know why they're not better at it. I mean, humans already have drugs that stop memory formation, but otherwise leave you awake. So why don't the aliens just use those? I'm, stealing them from a human warehouse if they need. They could just send in a drone and dose a person in bed with enough Versed or one of the other drugs that they can't form new memories for however long they need, and then they can move in and abduct the person, and they won't remember anything. No screen memories required. In any event, Whitley began to wonder if his memory of an owl watching him from outside the window that night might be a screen memory, with the barn owl taking the place of an alien, presumably because of how the barn owl's prominent eyes might look like the unusual eyes of an alien. Because, as they say on Twin Peaks,
the owls are not what they seem.
But Whitley's suspicion that this might have been a screen memory never really went anywhere in terms of evidence. It was a speculation on his part, and it could have been a false memory or a dream, or it could have been a real memory, but then new snowfall covered up the owl's tracks. However, one way or another, this idea doesn't really lead anywhere in terms of evidence.
We've covered the essence of Whitley's first experience, at least in terms of him realizing something weird was going on. When did the second experience occur?
It actually occurred a couple of months earlier in 1985, but Whitley did not initially realize its significance. What happened after the December 26 experience was that Whitley went into a kind of downward spiral. At first, it seems he didn't remember anything about what happened on that night, but he started going through a bad time. He couldn't concentrate on books he was reading. He couldn't concentrate on TV shows. He was experiencing a good bit of fatigue. He was short-tempered and irritable with family members and neighbors. And he felt so bad that he wrote a short story called Pain in an attempt to work out his feelings. Just over a week later, on January 3rd, he had a pain behind his right ear where the visitor had allegedly performed an operation on him, and his wife found a tiny pinpoint-like scab there. His memories of the December 26th experience started coming back, and he realized they might be UFO related. In the course of reading about UFOs, he had come across the name Bud Hopkins. Hopkins was an abstract artist, and Whitley had known about him from his work in the art community. But Hopkins was also a UFO researcher. In fact, he was a leading researcher into alien abductions in the 1980s and 1990s. His first book on the subject, which had come out in 1981, was called Missing Time. Hopkins, like Whitley, was also based in New York City, so Whitley called him up and they got together. He told him about the December 26th experience, and Hopkins asked if he'd had any other unusual experiences. Whitley remembered several, and then a particular one came back to him that had happened only a couple of months earlier.
After a moment's reflection, I blurted out, "I seem to remember a night the house burned down, but it didn't burn down. All hell had broken loose on a night in early October. There had been an explosion that woke up the whole household. Strange things had happened, but for some unknown reason, we had simply put them out of mind. We hardly even discussed them. But that time, they didn't happen only to me. We'd had house guests. If anything had really happened, they would certainly remember. Here was a chance to put this to the test. If nobody remembered anything, I would be able to dismiss this embarrassing business of aliens."
Interestingly, after the early October experience, Whitley had also gone through a bad patch, and his wife, Anne, had noted that what happened to Whitley's mood in October and what happened in December were quite similar. Whitley had also been experiencing unexplained anxieties and fears, which is what led him to start checking around the cabin before bedtime to see if there were any intruders. He also went out a week or two later and bought a shotgun for protection, though he wasn't consciously thinking about any alien visitors. Still, maybe something similar had happened in October.
After he thought about it, what did Whitley remember about the experience in October?
It had taken place on the night of Friday, October 4th, 1985. Whitley and their son and two other people were at the cabin. These two other people were both authors. One of them was Jacques Sandulescu, a Romanian immigrant, and the other was Jacques' girlfriend, an author named Annie Gottlieb, not to be confused with Anne Strieber. They all went to bed as normal, but then sometime during the night, Whitley woke up and saw a bright blue light on the living room ceiling. He tried to think what could explain this bright blue light, but he couldn't think of a normal explanation. For example, their porch light did not have bulbs in it, so it couldn't be that.
Finally, I hit on what seemed to me a sensible solution. The chimney must be on fire and dropping sparks into the front yard. I had to do something about it at once. Then I fell into a deep sleep. The last thought I remember before dropping off, with my heart still hammering, was that the roof was on fire. That was the first such wildly inappropriate reaction on that night, but it was not to be the last. I do not know what time this all took place, but it was well after midnight. Sometime after I fell back to sleep, I was again awakened, this time by a loud report, as if a firecracker had popped in my face. My wife cried out, and downstairs, my son began shouting. When I opened my eyes, I was stunned to see that the entire house was surrounded by a glow that extended into the fog. I thought to myself, "You damned fool. You fell asleep, and now the fire's gotten worse." I finally managed to get up. As I did so, I said to Anne, "The roof's on fire. I'll get our son and wake up the others." I started downstairs. I hadn't gotten halfway across the room before the glow suddenly disappeared. I was very confused. There was nothing to do but tell Anne that I had made a mistake, then go downstairs to comfort my son. On the way, I met Jacques in the hall. His presence terrified me, and I jumped back away from him. Then I apologized for being so startled by a friend, told him to calm down and go to bed, and added that nothing was wrong. I continued into my son's room and embraced him. In a few minutes, I was back in bed, and the household was again asleep. The next morning, little was said about the incident. I do remember Annie mentioning that Jacques had been bothered by the light the night before. I didn't understand that because their bedroom door had been closed, so they couldn't have seen the bathroom light, which is left on for our son. I didn't remember my confusion about fire.
So that's what Whitley himself remembered about the incident after he thought about it. However, the weekend after it occurred, he also remembered seeing a large crystal, hundreds of feet tall, standing on end right over the house and glowing with blue light. He told Anne about this, but he sensed that she didn't believe him.
In the case of this experience, there were 4 other people who were in the house, and Whitley had planned to ask them about what they remembered. What did he find out?
The first person he talked to was Anne. She remembered being woken up by a bang, but she did not remember the glow. And she didn't remember him saying that there was a fire, but she did remember him saying that there was no fire later on. The next person he talked to was his son. His son remembered that there was a bang. And he said, "A bunch of people told me it was okay, you just threw your shoe at a fly." Whitley was surprised by this, and he asked him who told him this. His son replied, "Just a bunch of people who were around." Whitley was surprised enough that he called Bud Hopkins, who recommended that instead of asking his son about memories, Whitley should ask him about any strange dreams he may have had. His son did remember a strange dream he had at the cabin and said,
"I dreamed that a bunch of little doctors took me out on the porch and put me on a cot. I got scared and they started saying, "We won't hurt you," over and over in my head. That is my strangest dream, because it was just like it was real. It happened in the middle of another dream, when I was dreaming that me and Ezra were in a boat.
However, his son did not remember if this was the night of October 4th when he had his dream. Whitley then called Jacques and his girlfriend Annie. Jacques remembered the light. In fact, he said it was bright as daylight, and he thought that he and Annie had overslept and it was now morning. But he looked at the clock and it said it was 4:30 a.m. Then the light went away, and he heard Whitley saying through the door that it was okay and the light was gone, so he went back to sleep. Annie remembered being awakened by the bang, and she then thought that she heard the scurrying of little feet in Whitley's bedroom above her. She thought that it was the Striebers' cats, but they weren't there. They were back in New York City. She then heard Whitley come downstairs, and she heard him say through the door not to worry. She also thought she remembered Whitley telling her the next morning that some people had come down in a spaceship, but her memory was fuzzy. She wasn't sure she remembered him saying that, and she later instead thought she remembered him describing the crystal that he mentioned to his wife the next weekend.
Did he do anything else to follow up on this experience?
He did. In fact, he wanted to get more information about his December experience as well, so he decided to undergo hypnotic regression. However, he didn't want a hypnotist who was already a big believer in alien abduction and who might ask leading questions. He writes,
I was dubious about hypnosis. I'd read in Science News of a study that anybody under hypnosis can be induced to remember a UFO abduction and experience, complete with little men and all the trimmings. The hypnosis has only to ask the right questions, and the stories apparently just come pouring out. It is a flat-out myth that people can't lie under hypnosis. They can and they will, if they think that's what the hypnotist wants them to do, or if they themselves want to do it.
So Whitley had healthy skepticism about the value of hypnosis. He eventually settled on a hypnotist that Bud Hopkins recommended. His name was Dr. Donald Klein. He belonged to the New York State Psychiatric Institute, and he did lots of work with anxiety disorders. Dr. Klein had an open-minded interest in UFO phenomena, but he had not previously done hypnotism on reported abductees, and his credentials were extremely good. In fact, Klein has even been called the father of psychopharmacology. So Whitley settled on him.
We talked about hypnosis back in episode 52, so people can go to mysterious.fm/52 to hear what you said there. But can you give us a brief summary of your views on hypnosis?
In terms of its effect on memory, hypnosis is not a magic memory retrieval aid. In fact, as Agent Scully said,
"What is your opinion of hypnosis?"
I know that it has its therapeutic value, but it has never been proven to enhance memory. In fact, it actually worsens it, since people in that state are prone to confabulation.
In reality, people who are hypnotized are very likely to just be fantasizing about what the hypnotist asks them, and then they're led to interpret this fantasy content as if it were memories. And there are all kinds of false memories that come up under hypnosis, like we discussed in episode 93 and again in episode 94 on the Bridie Murphy reincarnation case. You can go back to mysterious.fm/93 and mysterious.fm/94 to hear those. But basically, when housewife Virginia Tighe was put under hypnosis, she reported memories of having been a woman in 19th century Ireland named Bridie Murphy. Only upon check-in, it turns out that none of the people she talked about ever existed. And she made a bunch of mistakes about Irish culture, so these memories were just confabulated. And cases like this are why modern academic reincarnation researchers don't use hypnosis, because it doesn't result in them getting verifiable information, as we discussed in episodes 275 and again in episode 276 on modern reincarnation research. This is not to say that a person who relaxes and tries to remember can't genuinely remember something. It's possible that they may come up with some genuine memories while hypnotized, just like it's possible to come up with some genuine memories by relaxing and trying to remember when you're not hypnotized. But the fact that hypnosis is generally unreliable as a memory aid means that we can't just trust what it produces. We need to get independent verification of anything said under hypnosis before we can be sure that it's not confabulation. Fortunately, and to his credit, Whitley made a point of writing down what he did remember of his experiences before any hypnosis was done, and everything that we've heard so far was what he remembered without hypnosis. Also to his credit, Whitley refrained from reading anything further about alien abductions to avoid contaminating what the hypnosis might reveal, though he had read an article about the Betty and Barney Hill abduction some years ago.
After he was hypnotized by Dr. Klein, what did he think he remembered about the experience?
One of the really good things about communion is that Whitley gives us exact transcripts of his hypnosis sessions, and from an investigative point of view, it's really good to have complete verbatim quotations of what was said. However, because of the question about the value of the hypnotic material and because it covers experiences we've already described, we won't be going through these transcripts in detail. Instead, I'll primarily be summarizing what the new apparent memories were. They did a regression for the October 4th experience first. And in this session, he remembered seeing a light come down past his bedroom window and a little man that seemed to be wearing a hood coming into his bedroom. He described the man as having slanted eyes and a bald head. The little man did something that seemed to put a strange, unpleasant sound in Whitley's mind. The little man also showed him pictures of the world blowing up, like from a nuclear war. He apparently did this by touching the center of Whitley's forehead with a kind of rod with a metallic tip. The visitor told him that what he was seeing was his home, the Earth. He also saw a vision of his son being killed by the atomic blast in a park, and it was apparently this image that put the idea in his head that the house was burning down. Whitley also had an image of his father, who was deceased, dying on a couch with his mother sitting by doing nothing. He found this image very horrifying, and while his father had died on a couch, what he saw was different than what his mother had reported. Whitley concluded that the images he saw, the world burning, his son dying, and his father dying, were representations not of reality, but of his deepest fears. And he thought that the images he was shown may have been some kind of psychological test that the visitor was performing on him, which could explain the dark period that Whitley went through after this experience if all of his deepest fears had just been stirred up.
What about the sound of the explosion that Whitley said woke him and other people in the house up?
Under hypnosis, he said that this was caused by a strange needle-like device that the visitor used. He struck it like a match in the air, and its end sparked, and it caused a loud banging, clapping, thudding sound, which Annie Gottlieb had said was as loud as banging a big, heavy door against a wall. However, the rest of the hypnosis session did not unearth anything else about the events of that night.
Then, what about the session they did looking at the December 26th event? What did Whitley report remembering about that?
It covered the same basic things, seeing a single, seemingly armored little visitor come in through his bedroom door, followed by a group of other visitors in dark coveralls. He became paralyzed, and they took him outside naked, with him looking up, staring at the sky. He clarified under hypnosis that they had him on some kind of platform or flattened chair, like a dentist chair. He was then taken up into a craft of some kind. He reported talking with the feminine-seeming visitor who he says looked old, and she confirmed that she was old. She then told him that they were going to do an operation on him, and to help him stop screaming, they let him smell one of them. When Whitley objected that they had no right to do an operation on him, she said they did have a right, and then they did the operation on his head. They also told Whitley that he was their chosen one, and he objected to this, but the female assured him that this was true. They also cut him on his finger for some reason, then returned him to his home. The floor disappeared below them. He went sailing down through the air, and in no more than a minute, he was back in his home.
Did anything else happen in this session?
Yes. While Dr. Klein asked Whitley if he knew what the visitors had chosen him for, he said no, not for anything as far as he could tell. He then mentioned that he knew they had a lot of other people too, and he'd seen a bunch of them lying down. At this point, Whitley's diction changed, and he reverted to his native Texas accent because he had grown up in Texas. His voice apparently got softer and more childlike, and so Dr. Klein asked him how old he was. Whitley reported that he was 12 years old. He then related an apparent memory of another visitor encounter that occurred when he was a boy. It seemed to occur when he, his father, and his sister Patricia were on a train coming back to Texas from Madison, Wisconsin in 1957. While they were on the train, they apparently had been abducted into a visitor ship, and Whitley remembers sitting up, awake in bed, or something like a bed, with some kind of box or device over him. He also remembered seeing a bunch of soldiers in uniforms lying on beds unconscious. The seemingly female visitor was there, and when he asked why the soldiers were there, she replied that they were alone, presumably meaning that they were taken because they were alone. Whitley wanted to understand the purpose of taking them, and she said that they were there so the visitors could look them over and then they would be sent home. Whitley also saw his sister Patricia unconscious, which kind of bothered him. But what really bothered him was seeing his father standing a few feet away from him. His father was terrified, and he could faintly hear his father screaming, which really alarmed the 12-year-old Whitley. But that was the essence of that experience.
That was the third of what you said would be 4 experiences reported in the book. When did the fourth happen?
Whitley had his initial hypnosis sessions in the first week of March 1986. He continued with hypnotic work, and his wife was also hypnotized to see what her results would be. Following one of these sessions, Whitley discovered that he had a very powerful, vivid mental image of one of the visitors. It formed the basis of the cover artwork for Communion, which we're using as episode artwork today. Whitley was struck by how vivid the image was and by the fact that it was interactive. He could have the mental image change the position of its body so that he could get a detailed close-up look at different parts of it, like its hands and its feet. He was very surprised by this, as he didn't normally have this kind of mental image. Personally, I was a bit surprised at him being so surprised, because I have mental images like that all the time. A while ago, I discovered that I have a condition known as hyperphantasia, which is the opposite of aphantasia. Aphantasia occurs when a person does not have mental images, and aphantasiacs tend to assume that when other people say stuff like, imagine yourself lying in a field of grass, that it is some kind of metaphor and not meant to be taken literally. Hyperphantasiacs are the opposite and have intense mental imagery. I've often said that I basically have a mental holodeck around me. I can conjure the image of any environment I want and walk around in it, which now that I think about it is also a Cylon trait. I can certainly conjure up any 3D shape that I want and have it move in front of me. So conjuring the image of an alien and having it turn or lift its hands or feet so I can inspect them would be nothing unusual for me. But it was unusual for Whitney, and he wondered where this image came from. One possibility that he thought of was that the hypnosis may have stirred up his imagination. Another possibility he thought of was maybe he came into telepathic contact with the visitors, and they were projecting the image into his mind and responding to his desires to see different parts of it close up. It was this that led to the fourth and final experience that he finds most credible.
How and when did that happen?
It happened on the evening of Saturday, March 15th, 1986, less than 2 weeks from when he was first hypnotized. He, his son, and a little girl who was a school friend of his son's had gone up to the cabin, and this happened as a kind of prelude to the experience.
Before dinner, I took a walk along our quiet, private road. It was a moderately clear night with a quarter moon. On the walk, I saw a hair-thin stream of light come straight down out of the sky. I thought, I'm disappointed in myself, or in them. Why such a dismal little manifestation? It was dark when the 4 of us sat down to the dinner table. We had been eating for only a few minutes, when our son's guest suddenly shouted, "A little airplane covered with lights just flew through the front yard." There was real shock in this kid's face. The child looked at me, obviously distressed. My impulse was to hide under the table, but I pulled myself together and managed instead to speak in an offhand and reassuring manner. "There's an air base near here," I said. "The National Guard base is 30 miles away," but it was all I could think to say. "We don't let those things bother us. Best to just forget about it." I got up and went outside, but saw nothing. Soon the shock subsided, and the children went on eating.
To make this clear, when Whitley went for his walk, he was thinking about the mental image of a visitor he had. And if he was in mental contact with the visitors, he was disappointed by it. He wanted more confirmation of their reality than this image produced. That's what he was thinking about on the walk. And then, while they were eating dinner, the little girl, who was 7 years old, was looking out the window and saw a little airplane covered with lights fly through their yard. This, however, was only a prelude to the experience itself.
Sometime during the night, I was awakened abruptly by a jab on my shoulder. I came to full consciousness instantly. There were 3 small people standing beside the bed, their outlines clearly visible in the glow of the burglar alarm panel. They were wearing blue coveralls and standing absolutely still. They were familiar figures. Not the fierce, huge-eyed feminine being I have described before, but rather the more dwarf-like ones, stocky and solidly built, with gray, humanoid faces and glittering, deep-set eyes. They were the ones I felt were the good army when they took me on December 26th. I thought to myself, my God, I'm completely conscious and they're just standing there. I thought that I could turn on the light, perhaps even get out of bed. Then I tried to move my hand, thinking to flip the switch on my bedside lamp and see the time. I can only describe the sensation I felt when I tried to move as like pushing my arm through electrified tar. It took every ounce of attention I possessed to get any movement at all. I marshaled my will and brought my attention into the sharpest possible focus. Simply moving my arm did not work. I had to order the movement to labor at all. All the while, they stood there. I struggled, bit by bit, clawing closer and closer to the lamp. I turned my head, fighting a pressure that felt as if a sheath of lead had been dropped over me, and saw the light switch in the dark. I watched my hand move slowly closer, and finally felt the switch under my finger. I clicked it. Nothing. Tried again. Still nothing. The electricity was off. The burglar alarm was still working because it had a battery backup, but apparently it meant little to them, as they had entered the house without tripping it. When I turned my head back, I confronted a sight so weird, I thought afterward I did not know how to write about it. I still don't, so I am just going to plunge ahead. Beside my bed, and perhaps 2 feet from my face, close enough to see it plainly without my glasses, was a version of the thin ones, the type I have called her. It was not quite right, though. Its eyes were like big black buttons, round rather than slanted. It appeared to be wearing an inept cardboard imitation of a blue double-breasted suit, complete with a white triangle of handkerchief stitching out of the pocket. I was overcome at this point by terror so fierce and physical that it seemed more biological than psychological. My blood and bones and muscles were much more afraid than my mind. My skin began tingling. My hair felt like it was getting a static charge. The sense of the presence in the room was so unimaginably powerful and so strange. I tried to wake up Anne, but my mouth wouldn't open. The moment I thought of the kids, a clear picture flashed in my head of the 2 of them sleeping peacefully. The thing before me seemed like a sort of interrogatory. Why the suit? Did it mean that they were showing me a male? If this was a hive species, there might well be more than one sex, and they might be physically very different. Females, males, and stocky little drones? Now what was I going to do, having called them? Lie here and quake? I had wanted to communicate. They were obviously waiting for me to do something. I saw their faces so clearly, their eyes dark, glittering pits in their dull, grayish-brown skin. I could not help noticing that there was a sort of jollity about these beings. I'd thought before that they seemed happy. Perhaps whatever they were trying to do was going well. They had responded to my summons. What on earth should I say? I wanted them to know that I was still in possession of myself, that despite what I can only describe as a terrific assault against me, physically and mentally, I was still functional and on some level independent. More than this, I wanted them to know how I felt about them, despite all the complex commotions of what they were now doing to me. There may very well be good reasons for that behavior. Have all of their contacts with human beings been peaceful? And how about me? Had I fought in the past? If they had a hive mind, it might be that the amount of volition I had left was all they could allow me without risking loss of control of the situation. There was and is no way that I would ever make a provocative gesture in their presence. In fact, I wouldn't move at all unless bidden, not until I understand more. I had to communicate in some non-threatening manner. Again, it took an absolute concentration of will, a centering of my attention, and the application of the most careful effort to the muscle of my face. But I did manage to smile. Instantly, everything changed. They dashed away with a whoosh, and I was plunged almost at once back into sleep.
So that's the fourth and final experience. Whitley woke up in the night, again, almost totally paralyzed. He saw several of the visitors, including a taller, possibly male one, wearing what looked like a cardboard imitation of an old-styled human suit. Despite his paralysis, he managed to smile, and they left. And so, having covered the four experiences that Whitley finds most credible, we're now in a position to look at them from the perspectives of faith and reason.
And before we do that, we'd like to take a moment to thank our patrons who make this show possible, including Carolyn R., Jamie K., Thomas W., Jeffrey M., and Michael F. Their generous donations at sqpn.com/give make it possible for us to continue Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World and all the shows at StarQuest. And you can join them by visiting sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you by DeliverContacts.com, offering top brand contact lenses at always low prices with free delivery. Visit DeliverContacts.com. And by the Ascension app. Never leave home without a trusted Catholic translation of the Bible. Download the Ascension app today and you'll have the full text of the Great Adventure Bible, the Catechism, and answers to more than 1,000 frequently asked questions about the Bible available at your fingertips. The Ascension app is the best place to listen to Bible in a Year with Father Mike Schmitz and watch video reflections on the daily Mass readings from hundreds of top Catholic evangelists. Download the Ascension app today at www.ascensionpress.com/Jimmy Akin. So, Jimmy, what theories are there about Whitley's experiences?
As always, we need to start by considering the normal hypotheses before we look at the paranormal ones, because normal experiences are more common than paranormal ones. Under the heading of normal explanations, we can mention hoax. That is, either someone hoaxed Whitley into having these experiences, or he was hoaxing them himself. That is, lying about them in his book. Secondly, they could be the product of mental illness. Third, they could have been hallucinations due to some physical cause. Fourth, they could have been hallucinations due to something like alcohol or drugs. And fifth, they could be mistaken interpretations of some natural phenomena that Whitley had experienced.
What about more exotic paranormal explanations?
There are several possibilities here, and to his credit, Whitley isn't definitive about which might be the correct one. That's one reason he says that the experience involved visitors rather than aliens. Of course, the interpretation that first suggests itself is that these were aliens, and specifically the gray aliens that we see in pop culture all the time. However, Whitley also considers the possibility that they might be cryptoterrestrials. In Greek, kryptos means hidden. So cryptoterrestrials would be hidden terrestrial beings, a race from here on Earth that we normally aren't aware of. We'll do an episode on cryptoterrestrials in the future. Specifically, Whitley wondered whether the visitors might be the creatures that are responsible for historical accounts of fairies, with fairies supposed to be a hidden race that lives here on Earth. We talked about one such report of fairies back in episode 109 on the Cottingley fairies. It's at mysterious.fm/109, so you can check it out. And we'll be talking about fairies more generally in a future episode. Whitley also considered the possibility that the visitors might be something like ghosts. His idea was maybe humans are kind of a caterpillar butterfly species, with our living stage being like a caterpillar and the visitors being what we become after death. He considered the possibility that the visitors might be generated by the human mind. That is, they're still objectively real entities, but they're generated by our minds, which would make them what are sometimes called tulpas or thought forms, which we'll also talk about in the future. Whitley thought that they might be visitors from another dimension, or what are sometimes called interdimensionals, and he thought that they might be visitors from another time, or what are sometimes called extratempestrials. We'll have future episodes on both the interdimensional and extratempestrial ideas. In any event, he came up with quite a number of possible paranormal explanations, and I think rightly he wasn't definitive about which of them might be correct if these were paranormal experiences.
Before we look at Whitley's experiences from the reason perspective, let's look at them from the faith perspective. What would the faith have to say about the different paranormal explanations Whitley came up with?
Not much. The faith doesn't really have anything to say about the existence of aliens, cryptoterrestrials, thought forms, interdimensionals, or time travelers. It does teach that ghosts or disembodied human spirits exist, and they can sometimes appear to the living. I don't know why they would want to appear looking like gray aliens with what seem to be spaceships, but if they did, the faith wouldn't say that's impossible. It's just so different than what normally happens in a ghost encounter that I'd find it very improbable.
What about demons? Could the visitors be demons?
As we always say, the demon hypothesis is not impossible, but you need evidence if you want to propose it in a particular case, and I don't see good evidence for demons here. These demons didn't try to get Whitley to worship him or worship idols. They didn't tell him things contrary to the Christian faith, and they didn't display an aversion to the holy. Yes, they were frightening and kidnapped him, but, lots of things are frightening and can kidnap you without being demons, like, living human kidnappers. They also tend to be frightening and kidnappy. We also talked about the need to not just leap to the demon hypothesis back in episode 188 on whether it's always demons, so do go to mysterious.fm/188 to hear more about why you need evidence and what kind of evidence you need.
Then let's turn to the reason perspective. What about the normal explanations you mentioned? Could this have just been a hoax?
The first variant of the hoax explanation was that someone might be hoaxing Whitley, that is, tricking him into thinking that he was having encounters with the visitors. Here, we need to differentiate between the material that came up in hypnosis from the stuff that happened without it. When it comes to the hypnotic material, it is possible for a hypnotist to deliberately or unintentionally lead someone to think that they've been encountering aliens, but to do that, they generally need to use leading questions, and the transcripts of the hypnotic sessions don't seem to contain a lot of leading questions, so I don't think that Dr. Klein was hoaxing him. When it comes to the other material that happened to Whitley while he was at the cabin, it either would have happened in dreams when Whitley was asleep or after he woke up like he thought. I don't know of any good way to get people to dream about specific things. Even if you give someone a drug that will cause them to have weird dreams while they're asleep, you can't guide those dreams toward aliens. And to hoax him while he was awake, you would need a group of short people who are willing to dress up as aliens and impersonate the visitors and get past his security system, and I don't see any evidence for such a group. So I don't think the somebody was hoaxing Whitley explanation is probable.
What about the idea that Whitley himself was pulling a hoax, that he was simply lying, perhaps to get a best-selling book. Communion was a huge bestseller for 6 months in 1987.
This is what a lot of people accused Whitley of doing at this time. They also pointed to the fact that he had previously written horror novels, and so maybe he just took a horror novel idea he had and presented it as fact rather than fiction. So the accusation that the Communion was a literary hoax was a very common accusation.
Did Whitley say anything in response to this charge?
Well, he said it wasn't true, which you would expect him to say regardless of whether or not it was true. What would help settle the question is evidence, and Whitley did make some implicit arguments in this regard. He noted, partly in the 2022 preface to the book, he noted that he had been achieving a lot of literary success in the book world now that he had moved away from horror. For example, with his cautionary novel War Day about a limited nuclear war. But he says that after Communion came out, all his new literary friends dropped him. His reputation took a big hit, and he was subject to tons of ridicule. He also says that his son was mercilessly bullied in school after Communion came out.
What do you make of this? Does it show he wasn't hoaxing if publishing the book caused all these negative consequences?
I think the evidence has some value, but I don't think it's conclusive. This is because you can't always foresee all the consequences of your actions. I thus can imagine that a hoaxer would be more focused on getting a best-selling novel through the press, thinking of all the money it will bring in and not realizing all the costs that will be associated with it. If he was hoaxing, maybe Whitley thought that the reputation hit and the backlash just wouldn't be as bad as they turned out to be, and so he published anyway.
What's your basic thought on whether Whitley was hoaxing?
I can't rule it out. In principle, people, including authors, do hoax things, but I also can't say that it's what happened. Just like believers can't leap to the demon hypothesis without evidence, skeptics can't just leap to the hoax hypothesis without evidence. And I don't have fully convincing evidence for hoaxing here. However, I would note that Whitley admits to sometimes telling people things that weren't true. For example, at one point, he says this.
Then our nearest neighbors suddenly arrived. They appeared without warning. We tend to be very private in our sparse community, and this was only their second spontaneous visit in the 2 years we have been neighbors. I went downstairs to see them. No sooner had we started talking than I found myself complaining that I thought I had seen the light of a snowmobile in the woods between our houses at about 3 a.m. I was horrified at myself. What was I saying? I couldn't remember any such thing, and I knew it even as I spoke. Our neighbors offered the thought that the woods were too thick for a snowmobile to maneuver, which is true. Then I said that it must have been the lights on his house. He has 2 floodlights that shine out over his backyard. He explained that these lights had been off, but promised to redirect them so they couldn't be seen from our house. I knew even then that the lights hadn't been bothering me so late at night, although they were sometimes bothersome early in the evening, now that winter had stripped the woods of their concealing leaves. My memory of the snowmobile was as hollow as my memory of the owl. After some small talk, our neighbors went home. I was not pleased with my own behavior, and found it hard to understand, because it seemed so non-volitional, almost as if I had been talking against my will.
According to my memory of the book, this is one of several instances where Whitley acknowledges that he inexplicably said things he didn't believe. Also, his wife was hypnotized by Dr. Robert Nyman, and this exchange occurred. Anne had been asked about when Whitley reported the giant crystal in the sky, and then this exchange occurred.
Dr. Nyman. Did you look for it? Anne. Oh no, because I knew it wasn't real. How did you know it wasn't real? Whitley's a fairly down-to-earth guy. No, he isn't. He's not? No, because there couldn't be a crystal in the sky. He said it had a point that touched the earth. It didn't surprise you hearing Whitley, that he sees things like that? No. Why didn't it surprise you? Well, I guess I just thought he'd explain it later. Whitley, you know, said he's flown around the room. What do you say to something like that? When was that? Oh, he was saying that last year.
So Whitley himself admits to sometimes, without knowing why, saying things that he knows aren't true. And Anne admitted that Whitley was not a fairly down-to-earth guy who always said conventional things, something that Whitley openly acknowledges in the book, that he's not down to earth. So in light of this, how do we know that Whitley wasn't feeling compelled to say things in the book that, even though he couldn't explain why he was saying them, he knew didn't happen on some level? Now, we don't have proof of conscious intent to lie, but we do have reason to question Whitley's reports. However, we haven't even looked at the other possible explanations yet, and one or more of them might explain the reported experience without the need to propose a hoax. So rather than leap to the hoax hypothesis, we need to take a look at the other possibilities, and we need to look at them seriously first.
Then let's look at the next possible explanation you mentioned, mental illness. Could Whitley have thought he had these experiences because he was mentally ill?
Here, we're fortunate enough to have expert testimony because Dr. Klein, the psychiatrist who hypnotized Whitley, wrote a public statement on the topic, and he gave permission for it to be published in Communion, where it appears as an appendix to the book. It says,
A statement from Donald F. Klein, MD. I have examined Whitley Strieber and found that he is not suffering from a psychosis. He is not hallucinating in a manner characteristic of psychosis. I also see no evidence of an anxiety state mood disorder or personality disorder. He is an excellent hypnotic subject who appeared to make an honest attempt while under hypnosis to describe what he remembered. He has approached the dilemma of what is happening to him in a careful and forthright way, and has pursued his investigation with diligence. After an initial period of stress, he became much more calm about the situation, and soon learned to deal with it in a psychologically healthy way. He appears to me to have adapted very well to a life at a high level of uncertainty. Donald F. Klein, MD, Director of Research, New York State Psychiatric Institute.
So Dr. Klein found no evidence that Whitley's experiences were due to mental illness, and he's a highly qualified individual to make that assessment, not only being a psychiatrist, but also the father of psychopharmacology. So unless new evidence emerges, I would consider that matter settled, though this absence of mental illness doesn't prove that Whitley wasn't a somewhat fantasy-prone personality who sometimes felt compelled to say things that he was aware weren't true, as we just heard.
What about the idea that his experiences could have been caused by hallucinations that were produced by some physical cause?
Well, various things can cause hallucinations, such as brain tumors, temporal lobe epilepsy, and very high fevers. After his experiences, Whitley reportedly had a magnetic resonance image or MRI scan of his brain, and it turned out that he didn't have a brain tumor. When it comes to temporal lobe epilepsy, Whitley strongly considered this as a possibility also, and he decided to get it checked out.
As the reading of temporal lobe electroencephalograms is such a subjective business, I decided I would arrange two separate temporal lobe tests, one by a neurologist recommended by Dr. Klein, and another through a different psychiatrist. The second neurologist carried out the same preliminary examination done by Dr. Klein's man and came to the same conclusion. There was no evidence of abnormality. He was then given a version of my December 26th story, but we never discussed hypotheses at all. That way, he felt no need to defend his feelings against one hypnosis or another. I went to the lab, took chloral hydrate, and endured the insertion of electrodes deep into my nasal cavity. A few days later, the results came back. Absolutely normal temporal lobe function, confirmed by both neurologists.
So it doesn't look like temporal lobe epilepsy was the cause either.
What about the idea of a fever producing them?
Whitley's initial experiences occurred during the fall and winter when many people come down with things that cause fevers, and Whitley did feel like he was running a temperature a couple of times in this period. However, to cause hallucinations, fevers need to be really high. Typically, they have to get up between 103 and 106 degrees Fahrenheit for that to happen. Normal human body temperature is often said to be 98.6 degrees, but in reality, normal body temperature varies between 97 and 99 degrees. When Whitley measured his temperature, it was only 98.8, which is within the normal range, and thus any temperature increase would have been an extremely mild one at most, not enough to cause hallucinations. There also are other possible conditions that can cause hallucinations, but suffice it to say that there doesn't seem to be any evidence for him having them.
Then what about the possibilities of alcohol or drugs inducing them?
According to Whitley, he and Anne rarely drank more than wine, and neither of them have ever done drugs. He also reports that on the night of the October 4th experience, the members of the party had no more than 2 drinks each, which is not enough to get you drunk enough to have hallucinations. If Whitley's telling the truth, I thus don't see any evidence for these experiences coming from consuming alcohol or other substances.
Then let's look at the last normal possibility you mentioned. Could these experiences have been due to the misinterpretation of some natural phenomenon?
To answer this question, we need to look at the experiences themselves, and we need to set aside the material that came up under hypnosis, since hypnosis can promote confabulation and you can't rely on hypnotic material unless it can be independently confirmed. Before we look at the experiences themselves, though, we should look at why Whitley identified these 4 as experiences as the most credible ones to be covered in the book.
Then let's look at them in the order we covered them. Why did Whitley think the December 26, 1985 event was among the most credible?
Because there was someone outside the household who saw something unusual that might be connected with it. Whitley writes,
The 18-year-old son of one of our neighbors saw something hovering near a road, not 5 miles from our cabin, at approximately 9:30 on a night in late December. He described it to me as huge and covered with lights, a typical description. He watched it for some time. Being the son of a former state trooper and pilot, he did not claim that it was a UFO, but simply told the truth. He did not know what it was, but it appeared to be a solid structure. And as it hovered for a substantial period, more than 15 minutes, it could not have been a flight of planes. I telephoned the Goodyear Corporation and found that their blimp was not in the area at that time. The only thing that I thought it could have been was some unknown blimp. But even that appeared hard to believe in view of what more I discovered about it.
So this provides some evidence that could support a paranormal explanation for Whitley's experiences, but I don't think it proves a lot. While Whitley was able to rule out the Goodyear blimp, he was not able to rule out the possibility of it being another blimp, and there are other blimps. I've seen them. Back in San Diego, I used to see a Sanyo blimp periodically. Whitley also didn't rule out the possibility that it was a lighted balloon or balloon chain, which could have been launched as part of a weather-based meteorological or other scientific survey. And he's already noted that there was a National Guard base 30 miles away, so maybe it was something they launched. The biggest problem here, though, is that the neighbor's son could only say that he saw this hovering lighted thing on a night in late December, so we don't know that it was the same night as Whitley's experience from the night of December 26th. Thus, while I wouldn't say that this report has no value, I don't think it provides particularly strong evidence of anything paranormal happening. So we'll need to look at the December 26th experience itself.
Why did Whitley think the earlier October 4th, 1985 event was among the most credible?
Because aspects of it were witnessed by Whitley's wife, Anne, by their son, and by their house guests, Jacques and Annie. More than one of them heard the bang, more than one of them saw an unusual light, and more than one of them heard Whitley come downstairs and say everything was okay. Before I consider those factors, though, I would also note 3 particular points. First, one of the things that struck Whitley was that his son had said that people who were around had told him that the bang was caused when Whitley threw a shoe at a fly. Whitley took this as a possible indication the visitors told him this, but why would the visitors tell him that? It doesn't sound like something an alien would say if, as Whitley thought under hypnosis, the bang was actually caused by a visitor waving a small needle-like device. It sounds more likely to me that this was a mistaken memory or perhaps a dream that the son had. I mean, it really sounds like a dream. Oh, yeah, your dad threw a shoe at a fly. I mean, whoever does that? Or maybe it was even something that Jacques and Annie told him, perhaps the next morning, and maybe they were the people who were around, though it sounds more like a dream to me. Whitley also was struck by his son's dream of being taken out on the porch by little doctors, which Whitley took as a possible indication that his son has been abducted, but it could also have been exactly what his son said it was, a dream. And his son did not remember if this dream occurred on October 4th or some other time they were visiting the cabin, so I don't think this evidence is particularly strong either. Then there's what Annie said, which was that she heard the sound of feet scuffling on the floor of Whitley and Ann's bedroom above her before Whitley came down, which perhaps could have been the feet of one of the or more of the visitors. Annie thought it was the feet of the Strieber's cats, but they weren't there. However, it seems to me that if you hear feet scuffling above you and then Whitley comes down the stairs, then the obvious conclusion is that it was Whitley's feet you heard. So I don't think any of these particular details provide significant evidence for a paranormal explanation.
What about the larger aspects of the experience that were witnessed by multiple people, the bang and the bright light?
Whitley considered several possibilities, and here's what he said.
I have done every conceivable thing to try to duplicate light like that. Our guest room has one small window overlooking a 7-foot deep covered porch. Beyond that, the land slopes up gradually, so that not even car lights from the road can enter that room, much less moonlight or sunlight. With the leaves gone during the winter, we determined that the lights from the neighbor's house are also invisible from that window. The movement-sensitive light doesn't shine directly in, but down the porch. Had it somehow turned on, even absent bulbs, Jacques would have seen not the trees and shrubs, but the outline of the porch interior, with the yard beyond in darkness. The reason for this is that the line shines past the window and down the length of the porch. Had the regular porch light been switched on, the same effect would have resulted. Even with the neighbor's lights on, the porch light on, and a car in the front yard, we could not duplicate the effect. Nothing I can conceive of can account for the major light phenomena on that night. It may be possible to explain the blue glow I originally saw on the ceiling, but not that massive burst of light from above. I visualized the whole roof being ablaze. Jacques thought it was mid-morning. Because of the fog, a helicopter, or indeed any sort of plane, was out of the question. A pilot told me simply, "Forget aircraft." At 4:30, the moon was still in the sky, but well below the line of the forest. Could the log have somehow magnified the moonlight, causing dark, sensitized eyes to mistake its mild glow for bright daylight? Such a thing may have been possible, but the moon was low in the west, and the source of the light was clearly directly overhead. And what about the explosion? Maybe it was thunder, but there were no thunderstorms in the area. Perhaps a freak bolt in some sort of unusual mini-storm caused it then. But the period of seeming daylight lasted many seconds, and was not apparent to anybody until after the explosion. Thunder follows lightning, not the other way around.
I appreciate all the efforts that he went to try to and generate similar light through normal means. That's definitely to Whitley's credit. However, I don't think that this process of elimination is particularly conclusive. In the first place, I wouldn't dismiss thunder and lightning as explanations so quickly. It's true that we see the flash of lightning bolts before we hear the sound of their thunder, since light travels at the speed of light and thunder only travels at the slower speed of sound. But when a thunderstorm appears, it isn't just usually one bolt of lightning, but many. So maybe one bolt of lightning struck near the house and everyone was asleep and it generated a loud bang that woke everyone up. They didn't see the light from that bolt because they were still asleep when its light arrived, but the sound woke them up. And then there was more lightning that was further from the house, so they either didn't hear its thunder or didn't notice it, but it was the light from this later lightning that caused the bright light. In fact, cloud-to-cloud lightning is often so high and so distant that you can't hear any thunder, so it could have been that.
But don't flashes of lightning last under a second?
Normally, individual bolts do tend to last under a second, but that is not always the case. Lightning can happen in a series with multiple flashes going off at the same time or one after another, which can generate a longer burst of light. And there is what's known as concurrent lightning, which lasts longer than normal. I looked it up, and some displays of lightning can last multiple seconds. In fact, we've measured instances where it lasted for over 17 seconds. So that could explain multiple seconds of bright light that they saw in the middle of the night.
What about Whitley's conclusion that the light could not have been an airplane or a helicopter because of the fog?
I was skeptical of this. Planes fly through clouds all the time, and clouds and fog are essentially the same thing. The only difference is in altitude. Fog usually only goes up to a few hundred feet at most, and it can be much less than that. Some fog is only 3 feet high. Planes don't normally fly at the altitudes where fog occurs, but they can, such as if they're doing a takeoff or coming in for a landing. I can also imagine situations where they might have to fly at a fog level because of an onboard emergency, or because they're doing a search and rescue mission, or because they're doing a manhunt for a dangerous criminal. In fact, in either of those cases, they might be using a searchlight to look for someone on the ground. And that could result in the bright light from directly overhead that they saw. Also, flares are designed to provide strong illumination for people on the ground. And some are designed to hang in the sky for extended periods. So a flare could also be responsible, and I wondered if a plane might be launching a flare and if that might have caused the bang. Well, it so happens that my brother-in-law, Rusty Coonfield, is a commercial pilot, so I called him and asked him about these possibilities. He indicated that the presence of fog would in no way prevent a circling plane or something like a helicopter with a searchlight from being responsible. First, because fog typically only goes up to 200 feet or so, or even less, and the plane or helicopter could have been flying above the fog. Secondly, because fog can be very localized. That's what's being referred to when you hear about patchy fog, or fog that only occurs in certain patches of ground. For example, Rusty pointed out that if there was a pond or a stream near their house, the temperature differential could have caused a patch of fog around the Strieber's cabin, but not elsewhere. So it's entirely possible the light could have been caused by an airplane or helicopter using a searchlight or a flare. But Rusty also pointed out something else regarding the flare idea. I had thought of the flare being dropped from above, with the bang being caused when it was released or ignited. But Rusty proposed that the bang could have been caused by someone launching it from the ground, like firing it from a flare pistol. It then went up overhead and spent a number of seconds in the air and caused the bright light that was diffused by the fog around the cabin, however extensive that fog may have been. And people might use flares during the night for any number of reasons, like trying to navigate their way around in a forest, if it's dark and foggy. I thus think that there are perfectly good normal explanations for the bang and the bright light that the people in the cabin experienced. These events are consistent with something paranormal happening, but they in no way prove it. So I don't see them as strong evidence.
Why did Whitley think the event in 1957, where he was abducted from a train, was among the most likely of his experiences to be paranormal?
In this case, we don't have any independent witnesses to anything strange. Whitley, his father, and his sister did take a trip to Madison, Wisconsin by train in 1957 to visit some family relatives. Whitley remembers being sick and throwing up on the way back, but his father had passed on some years before the experience came up in Hypnosis, and his sister apparently didn't remember anything unusual happening on this trip, so we don't have any witnesses to notice anything strange. Instead, Whitley says that what makes him more confident of this experience is the letters that came in after communion was released and that described similar things happening to other people. However, I don't think that's particularly strong. While some people report being abducted from moving vehicles, which would include trains, it's not that many of them that do. And I don't see other elements in what Whitley reported under hypnosis that are unusual or out of step with the confabulation that hypnosis can produce. So I don't think this is strong evidence of anything paranormal.
Then that leaves us with the fourth and final experience. Why did Whitley think the March 15th, 1986 event was among the most credible?
Because of the prelude that happened at dinner before he went to bed. His son's friend from school reported a little airplane covered with lights just flew through the front yard. And this was just after Whitley had taken his walk, wishing that he had further confirmation of the visitor's existence. Okay, but I don't think this is strong evidence of anything paranormal. At this point, Whitley was thinking about the visitors constantly, and so he would be inclined to interpret anything that could be related to the visitors as possibly caused by them. So we're in a part of his life where he would be particularly prone to see things as involving the visitors that were just coincidental. And if we look at what the 7-year-old girl said, it's not strong evidence for a UFO. In the first place, she didn't say that it was a UFO or flying saucer or anything like that. She said it was a little airplane covered with lights. Taken on its face, that would mean it looked like an airplane, not like a flying saucer or other oddly shaped craft.
What about the fact that she said it was little and flew through the yard?
Well, today, the obvious explanation would be that it was a drone with lights on it, and someone was out drone flying and flew it through their yard. But this was 1986, and modern drones didn't exist then, so it couldn't be that. What did exist in 1986, though, was remote-controlled model airplanes. There had been model aircraft enthusiasts for decades at that point, so maybe someone was out flying a remote-controlled model airplane and it went through their yard. That indeed could be the little airplane covered with lights that she saw. On the other hand, it also could have been a normal-sized airplane covered with lights. It might have been what's known as a light aircraft, like a Cessna, the kind that ordinary people who are pilots often own and take up when they're flying for fun. A light aircraft would look like a little airplane compared to a big passenger or cargo plane, and it might have had its lights on, which you would expect at dinner time and really any time. Or it might have been a full-size plane with its lights on that the little girl saw in the distance, only since little children, like people in general, are bad at estimating distances. And from her low perspective, sitting at the table and looking out the window, she thought it was closer than it was. And so she thought it was little because it looked little. It wasn't taking up that big of an arc in her vision. And she thought it was flying through the yard, when really it was in the distance and maybe just appeared to be flying over the tops of the trees that she could see. In fact, if it was in the distance, so it looked small, that would explain why Whitley and the others at dinner didn't hear the sound of it going overhead, because it was too far away for the sound to carry, and so it looked small to the little girl. I thus think that there are multiple possible explanations to what the little girl saw that don't require a paranormal explanation. Now, I want to be clear that I don't think the factors Whitley mentions as adding weight to his confidence in these 4 experiences have no value. In the cases of the 3 experiences with independent witnesses, they do at least provide some confirmation that is consistent with a paranormal explanation, but they are also consistent with purely normal explanations. So I don't think they have no value, but I don't think they add much to Whitley's experiences themselves.
Then let's look at what Whitley himself reported experiencing. Do you think that they could be explained through the misinterpretation of purely normal things?
Well, since the hypnotic material can't be relied upon without independent verification, we need to set aside his report of the 1957 experience on the train entirely, since he didn't have a non-hypnotic memory of anything paranormal happening. He remembered the trip, but all he remembered about returning on the train was being sick and throwing up, not anything paranormal. We also need to set aside what he said under hypnosis about the October 4th, 1985 experience. So we need to set aside the idea that the bang was caused by a visitor waving a needle-like device. That that could simply be an idea he came up with under hypnosis to explain the bang, in light of the factors that he already suspected. He'd had an encounter with weird visitors. Whitley did remember some interesting things without hypnosis, like the blue light he saw on the ceiling, the bang, the bright light, and the thing he remembered a week later about seeing a big crystal above the house. When it comes to the latter, we don't really know if this is a memory or not. Whitley did not report going out of the house during the October 4th event. He didn't even report that under hypnosis. So it's not clear how he would have been outside the house to have the perspective needed to see a big crystal hovering above it. That could have just been a dream. When it comes to the blue light, that also could have been a dream, or it could have been a reflection or a light from inside or outside the house. It could have been almost anything. And Whitley does not present it, the little blue light, as strong evidence for anything paranormal. Seeing a light on the ceiling at night and not being sure what's causing it is not a strong indicator that something paranormal is happening. Then, when it comes to the bang and the bright light, we've already covered possible normal explanations for those, so I don't think we need to turn to the paranormal to explain the October 4th experience.
What about the December 26th experience? In that one, he non-hypnotically remembered seeing visitors come into his room and then apparently taking him outside and then on board a craft of some kind.
True. However, we must consider normal explanations for this that Whitley may have misinterpreted. And I think that the obvious one is dreaming. Whitley may have thought he woke up, but people think that they wake up when they're still dreaming all the time. They're called false awakenings. In fact, I remember an incident when my wife and I were staying temporarily at my parents' house. And one morning my wife came and woke me up to go and get ready to go down to the university. Then I got up, got dressed, and was getting ready to go. And then my wife came back and woke me up again. It turns out I had immediately fallen back asleep and started dreaming about my morning routine, thinking I was actually awake. And fortunately, she woke me up in time to meet my schedule for that day. Recently, I experienced another false awakening in a dream, and while I was still dreaming, I noticed inconsistencies in what I was experiencing, and I deduced that I must still be asleep, which was actually a big relief because this had been something of a nightmare, and my pickup had been wrecked in the dream. So it was a big relief to realize that my pickup that is wrecked here in this dream is actually fine in the waking world and isn't really wrecked. Thus, I had a false awakening in a dream, and it then turned into a lucid dream, which is when you realize that you're dreaming. And we'll have a future episode on lucid dreams. So maybe Whitley did momentarily wake up, but then fall back asleep and dreamed about the visitors. Or maybe he never woke up at all, but had a false awakening and dreamed about seeing the visitors. Then there's the fact that he reports being paralyzed by these beings who he perceived as threatening and doing bad things to him. Well, that sounds like sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a common condition. Around 4 in 10 people, or 40%, report experiencing it at least sometime. And it doesn't have to be a chronic condition that you have over and over. It may only happen a single time or a few times. Basically, when we go to sleep, our brain turns off our ability to control our muscles and paralyzes us. That keeps us from acting out our dreams as we experience them. And that would be really dangerous if we did. So we need to be paralyzed while we're asleep. But sometimes something goes wrong with this process. Sometimes the paralysis turns off while we're still asleep. And so the person may get up and start sleepwalking. Other times, the paralysis stays on even though we're starting to wake up. When that happens, we may try to move and be unable to, which is something that will induce anxiety. It's scary to be unable to move when you're trying to. And since you're not fully awake yet, your dream module is still on and may start dreaming about something sinister and menacing you because of the paralysis anxiety that you're experiencing. For example, you may dream that there is something sitting on your chest, since you can't breathe in an unrestricted way because of the paralysis. So you might dream that there is a monster or a witch, an old hag, sitting on you. In fact, sleep paralysis is sometimes called old hag syndrome. Not everybody dreams about something sitting on their chest, though. But in this anxiety-inducing state, many people dream about being menaced by something, like monsters or demons or aliens or thieves or axe murderers or something. In fact, I've had sleep paralysis myself on a handful of occasions, only in my case, I wasn't being menaced by aliens. Instead, I thought there were sinister government military agents outside my bedroom, and I dreamed that I could see the thin green laser beams coming from the laser sights on their rifles in the hallway. Well, it sounds like Whitley was experiencing sleep paralysis and dreamed about aliens. So he dreamed that the aliens paralyzed him and then took him and did frightening things to him while he was paralyzed. This seems confirmed by other aspects of the experience, like when they said they were going to do an operation on him, and then they asked him, "How can we help you stop screaming?" He responded with the total non sequitur, "You could let me smell you." I mean, that's totally bizarre and dreamlike. If you're awake and someone is terrorizing you and you're screaming, you're not likely to ask to smell them to establish their good intentions so that you can stop screaming. That makes no sense. Even Whitley remarks on how bizarre the request was, but it does fit with the irrational logic that we explain in dreams, as do other things, like how the floor vanished from underneath him and he sank back down into his bedroom in less than a minute. So what this experience sounds like to me is dreaming coupled with sleep paralysis.
What about the physical effects that Whitley exhibited afterward, like the scab behind his ear and the cut on his finger that he thought the visitors gave him?
I'm afraid that they also don't show anything paranormal was happening. He thought that he got a scab from when the visitors stuck a needle in his head, but he could have gotten a little nick behind his ear that scabbed over for any number of reasons. In the book, he says he had a doctor examine the site and, the supposed injection point, and his doctor said it looked like a spider bite. So maybe it was a spider bite or some other kind of insect bite. Maybe a bug bit him while he was asleep, perhaps when it was crawling on his body and then he rolled over on it. Or maybe it was a bug whose bite you don't feel immediately, like a mosquito or tick or chigger. And then when he was asleep, the bite started to hurt or itch. Either way, while he was dreaming, his brain may have manufactured the needle incident to explain what he was now physically feeling. But really, it was nothing more than a spider or bug bite. When it comes to the cut on his finger, who knows how he got that? There's no explanation for why the visitors did it. And he was an author in a day when authors used a lot of physical paper, and you don't always notice when you get a paper cut. It could have happened before sleep or after sleep or even somehow during it, but he just didn't consciously notice it. But it started hurting while he was asleep, and his dream module invented the alien's cut in his finger as an explanation. Simply noticing that you have a cut on your finger that you previously weren't aware of is not strong evidence of the paranormal. So I'm afraid that I don't see strong evidence of the paranormal for this experience. It sounds like dreaming coupled with sleep paralysis and the misinterpretation of a couple of other naturally explainable things.
Then what about the March 15th, 1986 experience? What do you make of that?
Well, by this point, the idea of paranormal visitors was strongly on Whitley's mind. In fact, earlier that same evening, the little girl had reported seeing a plane with lights fly through their yard, and he immediately thought it might be a visitor craft, and he had been wanting further contact with the visitors as confirmation that those experiences were real. So it wouldn't be at all unexpected if that night he had another dream about the visitors. And also, once again, we have content that doesn't make much sense rationally, but sounds like something from a dream. Like seeing one of the visitors wearing what looked like a cardboard version of an old-fashioned double-breasted suit, complete with a triangular pocket handkerchief. That would be totally unexpected from an actual alien, interdimensional, or whatever. And Whitley himself comments on how bizarre it was, but like the request to smell the aliens to know their good intention, it makes much more sense if this was a dream. Then there's the fact that Whitley also reports paralysis in this experience. He says that he had to struggle mightily to get his hand onto the switch for the bedside lamp, and I know exactly what that's like. When I've had sleep paralysis, I've had to struggle mightily to move, like there's a huge weight on me, stopping me from being able to move my arms. Whitley describes it like pushing his arms through tar. He also reported having to struggle mightily to move the muscles of his face to smile at the aliens. So once again, this sounds exactly like sleep paralysis for me. I thus think that this experience, like the one from December 26th, was most likely a case of dreaming coupled with sleep paralysis.
And Jimmy, what's your bottom line here?
Well, I can't rule out that Whitley was abducted by aliens or some other kind of paranormal visitor, but I don't think that he's presented conclusive evidence that he was abducted in communion. In fact, he himself expresses doubt about exactly what happened to him, or whether it was a set of real physical experiences or just unusual psychological ones. And I appreciate his openness to both possibilities. That does him credit. When it comes to what actually happened, I don't have conclusive evidence for the hoax hypothesis, though Whitley does admit sometimes saying things that weren't true for reasons he couldn't explain. We have good evidence against the simple mental illness proposal. We don't have good evidence for this being due to hallucinations. And when we consider what he reported without hypnosis, it really sounds like the two instances of dreaming coupled with sleep paralysis were the most likely explanation for the core experiences, which means that we don't need to resort to the various paranormal ones, which Whitley himself was inconclusive about. I thus put what Whitley reported in communion as something that was consistent with the extraterrestrial hypothesis or other exotic hypotheses, but I don't think we have strong evidence for that here.
What further resources can we offer?
We'll have a link to Whitley's book Communion, also background information on him, Bud Hopkins, Donald Klein, and Screen Memories. Also the quote, "Sometimes a cigar is just a cigar," and a BBC article about a 17.1 second flash of lightning. Also information about sleep paralysis, including from WebMD.
Very good. Folks, and now it's time to hear from you. What are your theories about Whitley Strieber and what he reports in communion? You can let us know by visiting sqpn.com or the Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World Facebook page, sending us an email to feedback@mysterious.fm, sending a tweet to @MYS_world, visiting the StarQuest Discord community at sqpn.com/Discord, or calling our mysterious feedback line at 619-738-4515. That's 619-738-4515.
And I want to say a special word of thanks to Oasis Studio 7 for the video and animation work on this episode. You can check it out by going to my YouTube channel, youtube.com/Jimmy Akin. And while you're there, please do all the things that will tell YouTube to show this episode to other people. You can help the channel grow by liking the video, commenting on the video, and sharing it with others. Also, I am trying to grow my channel, so please subscribe and be sure and hit the bell notification so that you always get notified when I have a new video. These days, I have multiple videos per week.
I also want to thank Jacob Doyle for his voiceover work on this episode.
Also want to say a special thanks to my brother-in-law, Rusty Coonfield.
Jimmy, what's our next episode going to be about?
Next week, we're going to be talking about that new Vatican set of norms or rules for how to judge supernatural phenomena. This is a major update to how the church handles these things. It replaces a document from 1978, which we've already talked about on the show. So you won't want to miss how the Catholic Church is going to be analyzing supernatural phenomena going forward.
Folks, be sure to follow Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, TuneIn, on your favorite podcast app, or at Jimmy's YouTube channel, where, like you said, you should hit the bell to get notifications. Get your very own Mysterious World t-shirt, mug, or more in our merchandise shop at sqpn.com/merch. And you can find links to Jimmy's resources from our discussion on our show notes at mysterious.fm/320. And remember, to help us continue to produce the podcast, please visit sqpn.com/give. Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World is also brought to you in part by Rosary Army, featuring award-winning Catholic podcasts, rosary resources, videos, and the School of Mary online community, prayer, and learning platform. Learn how to make them, pray them, and give them away while growing in your faith at rosaryarmy.com and schoolofmary.com. And by The Grady Group, a Catholic company bringing financial clarity to their clients across the United States, using safe money options to produce reasonable rates of return for their clients. Learn more at gradygroupinc.com. And by Great Lakes Customs Law, helping importers and individuals with seizures, penalties, and compliance with U.S. customs matters throughout the United States. Visit greatlakescustomslaw.com. Until next time, Jimmy Akin, thank you for exploring with us our mysterious world.
Thanks, Dom.
And once again, I'm Dom Bettinelli. Thank you for listening to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World on StarQuest.